This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Former Congressman and foreign policy expert Mike Barnes offers his thoughts on Ukraine, Western Europe, and Florida politics. Economic researcher Tom Malleson makes the case for economic democracy in the workplace. And Bill Press talks with Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro on the border crisis. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Foreign policy expert and former Congressman Mike Barnes offers his assessment of Vladimir Putin and the struggle in Ukraine. And we say hello to former Congressman Mike Barnes of Maryland, who chaired the Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere Affairs and was a member of the Kissinger Commission on Central America. Subsequent to his congressional service, he has practiced law and served as president of the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence, and he is currently a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. Mike Barnes, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Always nice to have you with us as well. Can the United States afford to sit back and watch Russia gobble up eastern Ukraine? And is there a way to effectively counter Vladimir Putin without using military assets?
I think the one thing we need to remember in these kinds of events is this is not all about us. We in the United States tend to think that events all over the world happen because we did something or we didn't do something. Probably more important than our response to what Russia is doing is the European response, because they are more immediately impacted by what's going on there and because they can have more direct impact. If the Europeans are willing to engage in really tough sanctions, that'll be very, very serious for Russia. What we can do is important, but not as important as what we can do together with our allies in Europe. And it's yet to be seen how tough they're willing to be.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would imagine
nobody's suggesting, and nobody, in my view, should suggest any kind of military action by NATO or by the U.S. unilaterally. I think that would be really, really a terrible mistake.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned it's not always all about us, and this is a case where it's not all about us. It's certainly much more a European problem. But there is concern with systemic effects for the U.S., correct? I mean, so we do need to kind of be at the forefront, don't we?
Well, the U.S. needs to work with our allies, clearly, and be heavily engaged in this. But we can't go it alone. It won't. Well, we can, but it won't have anywhere near the impact that it'll have if we all do it together. And the Russians, I think, are carefully calibrating, how much the Europeans are willing to do to stand up to this kind of aggression.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the Obama administration made a fatal error by drawing a line in the Syrian sand and failing to intervene in any meaningful way?
Actually, I think the Obama administration protected U.S. interests in Syria fairly effectively with the diplomatic outcome that they reached. The weapons in Syria are being dismantled almost entirely already, and this is an important victory, really, of success of diplomacy. And I think to the people who suggest that what Putin is doing in the Kremlin is determined by what he sees in Syria is just nonsense. What Putin is doing in the Kremlin is what he has planned to do all along, and he's implementing a strategy.
We're speaking with Mike Barnes, former Maryland congressman, currently a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. How is the situation in Ukraine going to affect European or even the global economy? I sort of alluded to systemic effects. Do we need to have some? Are there significant concerns on our part right now?
Sure, there are. Unemployment in Europe is close to 12%, and if they have to scramble to get different sources of energy that raises the costs significantly. So this could hurt Europe's economy. Most directly, obviously, it'll hurt the Russians, which is the whole point. But yes, this is a risk, and this is a very risky game that Putin decided to play here. This is his call. He's created this mess, and the Russians are likely to be hurt the most by it. But there'll be significant fallout in Europe from tough sanctions, and the U.S. will get some collateral impact from it. Not anywhere near as severe as our friends in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Now, President Obama is trying to get comprehensive trade deals going in both Europe and in Asia. But aren't they doomed to failure, given the reluctance of so many Democrats to support them?
Well, my guess is they're doomed to not pass this year before the election because it's very, very going to be very tough to do it for the reason you suggest. Most Democrats don't want them, and the Republicans don't want to do anything to help Obama. They've certainly made that clear repeatedly. Conceivably, in a lame duck session after the election, you could move some trade deals. That's happened in the past. I think in the last 2 years of the Obama administration, we could very likely see some trade measures pass on a bipartisan basis, similar to the way Bill Clinton passed trade bills, with mostly Republican votes and fewer Democrats. Most of the Republicans voted for them. So I don't think they're doomed to failure forever, but I do just think the politics of the situation make it extremely unlikely that anything will pass this year before the elections.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're an expert on Latin America. Has the U.S. diplomatic standing improved any, and is Venezuela still going to be a problem?
Well, yes, the U.S. Diplomatic standing has improved, I think, really all over the world since the low points after Iraq and our role in the Middle East. But that said, there's a long way to go in Latin America. The best thing we could do to improve relations with our friends to the south would be to normalize relations with Cuba. Our policy has been a great success, right? We've had this policy of isolating Cuba since the 50s,
right.
And the Castro brothers are still in charge. So it's been a huge success, right? So we ought to keep doing this because it's been so successful. Well, all the Latins think we're really foolish to engage in that policy, and they're not even going to let us come to summit meetings of Latin American countries until we straighten out our policy with respect to Cuba. And it would help everybody, particularly the Cuban people, if the U.S. could find a way to modify our policy. That said, you're absolutely right that Venezuela is going to continue to be a thorn in everybody's side, particularly the side of the people of Venezuela who are struggling under the economic chaos that's been created by Chavez and now Maduro. It's tragic what's happening in Venezuela. It's a terrific country. I've been there many times, and it ought to be successful economically, but it's a disaster. It's a basket case economically right now. And that's a shame for the people there, mostly there, but it's a shame for their neighbors and us as well.
Now, and of course, we're changing speeds here on you a little bit, but before we let you go, as a part-time resident of Florida, can you give us a brief rundown on the gubernatorial race between Republican-turned-Democrat Charlie Crist and the Republican incumbent Rick Scott, and also maybe briefly touch on the special election coming up to replace the disgraced Republican Trey Radel?
Well, on the gubernatorial race, Democrats should be feeling, pretty confident right now. The current incumbent Tea Party Republican Governor Rick Scott has very, very low favorability numbers. He's trailing Charlie Crist in all the recent polls. One has Charlie up by 10 points. So that race is going to be just a battle to the end because Scott has said he's probably going to spend $100 million As you may remember, to get elected the first time, he spent $71 million of his own money to buy that gubernatorial race, and he won by less than 1% over Alex Sink. But Charlie Crist seems to be running an effective campaign, and he will not have anywhere near that kind of money, but he's raising pretty good money, and it'll be an exciting race to watch, and obviously extremely important for Democrats for the 2016 presidential election to have a Democrat in the governor's office in Tallahassee. That would be a big boost for Democrats in Florida to help with turnout and all the other issues in the elections in 2016. On that congressional race in Southwest Florida, where Trey Radel resigned after being caught in DuPont Circle in Washington with cocaine, purchasing cocaine from some undercover folks, and he resigned. Again, you have a wealthy fellow, came out of nowhere with a business background, never been involved in politics, Kurt Clausen, and he spent $4 million of his own money in the primary to win the Republican primary, and he will almost certainly be the next congressman for this short term to finish out Trey Radel's term just for the rest of this year, and then he'll have to run again in the fall. The Democrats have a respectable opponent, candidate, April Freeman, but it's a very, very Republican district. I think Obama got like 36% of the vote while carrying the state. So you see it's a very Republican area and sort of the home to the Tea Party. In some respects, the Tea Party really started in Fort Myers and that area in Southwest Florida. And Kurt Clausen looks like, and he's a Tea Party favorite. He ran on repealing Obamacare. And in fact, all the Republican candidates in the primary, there were 4 of them, all 4 of them, their number one item in their agenda was repeal Obamacare. So you get a sense of what's going on down there.
Yeah. Okay. I guess that's probably a little too big a hill to climb this time around.
Actually, one sort of amusing thing is toward the end of that primary, they started being pestered a little bit. Okay, you want to repeal it, but what would you do? And the thing they said was sort of all came out with the line now for Republican candidates is that we will repeal Obamacare, and what we'll replace it with will be a market-based approach, and we'll allow competition across state lines so that people will be able to get insurance from companies outside of their own state system. So the irony of that to me is that what they're really saying is we like Obamacare because it's market-based. It's, competition among insurance companies on an open exchange that you go on and you buy your insurance. So it sounds like they like that. But they're saying, no, it shouldn't just be in the state. You ought to be able to go out everywhere and buy your insurance. So what they're really saying is we want Obamacare not to be state exchanges. We want a national exchange. We want national health insurance. It's actually funny that these conservative Republicans are making this pitch. I don't think they actually know what they're saying. I don't think, first of all, I think they believe that Obamacare is socialism, so they don't understand. It's really market-based. It's competition among private insurance companies to get your business. They think it's socialism. But the second part, they say, no, it ought to be national. So it's actually pretty funny.
They think everything he does is socialism. So
that's right. That's right.
He can't really win.
But I really don't think they know what they're saying, and they don't understand Obamacare. And anyway, it's just funny.
Yeah. Well, former Congressman from Maryland, Mike Barnes, current senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. As always, sir, great to talk with you, and thanks for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Great to be with you. Thanks a lot.
We'll talk to you soon. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats.
We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Economic analyst Tom Malleson explains why Occupy Wall Street failed and calls for a new concept. Economic Democracy in the Workplace. And we'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Have you noticed that the powers that be employ an entirely different standard for measuring the health of America's job market than they use for the stock market? They're currently telling us that the job market is improving. What do they mean? Simply that the economy is generating an increase in the number of jobs available for workers. But when they say the stock market is improving, they don't mean that the number of stocks available to investors is on the rise. Instead, they're measuring the price, the value of the stocks. And isn't value what really counts in both cases? As a worker, you don't merely want to know that 200,000 new jobs are on the market, but what they're worth. Do they pay living wages? Do they come with benefits? Are they just part-time and temporary? Do they include union rights? What are the working conditions, etc.? In other words, are these jobs or scams? So it's interesting that the recent news of job market improvement doesn't mention that of the 10 occupation categories projecting the greatest growth in the next 8 years, only 1 pays a middle-class wage. 4 pay barely above the poverty level, and 5 pay beneath it, including fast food workers, retail sales staff, health aides, and janitors. The job expected to have the highest number of openings is personal care aide, taking care of aging baby boomers in their houses or in nursing homes. The median salary of an aide is under $20,000. They enjoy no benefits, and about 40% of them must rely on food stamps and Medicaid to make ends meet. Plus, many are in the, quote, shadow economy, vulnerable to being cheated on their already miserly wages. This is Jim Hightower saying, to measure the job market by quantity with no regard for quality is to devalue workers themselves. Creating 200,000 new jobs is not a sign of economic health if each worker needs 2 or 3 of those jobs to patch together a bare-bones living.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. The Occupy Wall Street movement failed because it didn't spell out concrete alternatives to the current economy, says researcher Tom Malleson, who lays out his alternative, economic democracy in the workplace.
And we say hello to Tom Malleson, assistant professor at King's University College at Western University and the author of a new book called After Occupy, Economic Democracy for the 21st Century. It's a book laying out ways to achieve the real economic equality sought by the Occupy Wall Street movement. Tom Malleson, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks very much for having me.
Now, the title of your book suggests perhaps that the Occupy Wall Street movement failed. Did it, and where should it go from here?
So I'm not sure that it failed. I think one of the things that it did quite successfully was identify the core problems that exist in our society at the moment. So the rampant inequality, the massive corporate power, the kind of financial system run amok. These ideas were really portrayed quite well, I think, by the Occupy Wall Street movement. The degree to which it failed was the degree to which it didn't do a good job of laying out and spelling out concrete alternatives. And people have pointed this out, and I think that's true. I think those of us who are involved in the Occupy movement were quite good at pointing out the things that we're against, the problems that we see, but we are not quite so good at articulating clear and coherent alternatives. And that's really the core goal of this book, is to try and do that and to point at some alternatives to the current economic structures that exist at the moment. So the book is called After Occupy because it's about looking forward for the people who are involved in those movements to kind of think about what alternatives might look like.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk a lot about economic democracy. How would you define it, and aren't there some inherent flaws if you assume we remain a capitalist system?
So the core idea of economic democracy is that democracy belongs not just in politics or in government where we're used to it, but belongs in the economy as well. The central paradox that the book investigates is that we live in a democratic society. We are generally proud of that. We see the fact that we are citizens of democracy as being an important part of our identity. And yet for all that, a central part of our society, the economy, has very little democracy in it, by which I mean workers do not elect their managers, finance is not allocated with any accountability to citizens, regular people don't get to participate in investment decisions. And so that's a central paradox. It's as if we've kind of drawn, made a wall down the middle of society and said, on this side, politics of democracy, and this side, economics, we won't, and yet calling our society as a whole democracy. That's the kind of paradox that the book grapples with on a philosophical level. On a kind of practical level, the other half of the book aims to point out the concrete alternatives that already exist in different parts of the world. So we look at worker cooperatives in Spain and in Italy. We look at participatory budgeting in Brazil, capital controls in Malaysia, public banks in India. So to really give the reader a sense of the viable, feasible alternatives that do exist.
Now, why would workers on a factory floor, for instance, do better than capitalists who are trained to allocate sources and determine pricing?
That's a good question. So I'm not arguing here that every worker should participate in every decision. I mean, clearly perhaps in very small businesses, very small worker cooperatives, maybe you can imagine a small coffee shop or a bike store, people can sit around a table and make decisions together. But clearly in large businesses, large organizations, that's not possible. You need managers, you need experts, for sure. The question is, are those managers and those experts accountable to the people that they're advising? And that's, I think, the crucial distinction, right? In a worker cooperative, what a worker cooperative fundamentally is a business that's owned and controlled by their workers. So what that means is that people elect the management in a one-person, one-vote basis. It doesn't mean that everyone participates in every decision, but it does mean that at the end of the day, the decision takers are accountable. Just like the analogy with the political system, when we as citizens don't participate in every decision the government makes by any stretch, but the people who do make those decisions are fundamentally, at the end of the day, accountable to us. So it's not an issue, I think, of workers participating in every decision, but it's about accountability. And I think it's important to point out that worker cooperatives are just as, if not more, efficient than conventional firms. And this is really, I think, one of the most surprising things that I found doing the research for this book is most of us have this idea of worker cooperatives as kind of small, bumbling organizations. But in fact, economists have been studying them for 30 years. And the evidence is quite clear that they are just as efficient as conventional hierarchical firms. That's found in the US, in Uruguay, in France, Italy, Sweden, Denmark, all over the place. We see that. And there are kind of clear reasons why that might be so. I'll just name two very quickly. One is that when workers own their own business, they have increased motivation. They're their own boss. Secondly, in worker cooperatives, there's more coordination because there's less antagonism and less hierarchy, and that has concrete payoffs. You have less absenteeism. You have less need to pay tons of supervisors to monitor all the time. Things like that give worker cooperatives an economic advantage.
It's more than just coming in and picking up a check for a week's worth of work.
Right.
Yeah, sure. No, it makes perfect sense. We're speaking to Tom Malleson, assistant professor at King's University College at Western University. He's the author of After Occupy, Economic Democracy for the 21st Century. Conceptually, though, what's wrong with unequal wealth, so long as everyone has a shot at attaining it?
Well, so first of all, I would say that everyone does not have an equal shot. There is nowhere near equal opportunity in this country. On average, an American child born in the bottom fifth of the income distribution has only a 7.8% chance of reaching the top fifth. So there's nothing like an equal opportunity. And when we look at the top, we find that of the 400 on the Forbes magazine, 40% of those people were born on the list. There's not equal opportunity, I don't think. But more than that, unequal wealth is a problem because it translates into unequal power. And that's what's really problematic. Wealth isn't simply an ability to buy things. It can translate in our economy into power over people. And that, to me, is where the problems lie. So think of a firm. If there's a business, the owner has been running this business for years, and then at a certain time decides to pass the business to his son or daughter. The son or daughter may have had no experience with the business, has no relationship with the workers, and yet can come in, the following day and start giving orders to those workers. So what I think, when we think of examples like that, that strikes us as objectionable, because what's being inherited in that kind of situation is not simply money to, buy things, but is power over people. And that's the danger of wealth, I think, is particularly the mechanisms in our society through which wealth can translate into power over people. That's the problem.
What is the link between economic power and political power? And couldn't there be a brand of economic power that doesn't infringe on people's political power?
Right. Yeah, so at the moment, one of the deepest problems with our contemporary system is that economic power affects political power so strongly and so prevalently. In the last election, the average senator spent $8.5 million winning his or her seat. So political democracy is not a game that most of us are able to play, right? Of the 435 members of the House of Representatives, 402 of them spent more than their opponent. In other words, 90% of the people who ended up winning their seats outspent their opponent. So again, this shows the kind of enormous influence that wealth has over the political system. Since the 2010 Citizens United decision, of course, that's become even worse. So is it possible for economic power not to infringe on political power? Yeah, I think so. I think that would require that economic power be accountable to the people affected by it. So workplaces become more accountable to their workers, finance, banks become more accountable to their communities. So that, I think, is possible, but it does require exactly what I'm talking about, of increases in economic democracy.
Mm-hmm. What would you say is your prescription for the non-hierarchical economy that you have in mind?
So one of the things that this book tries to do is offer a framework, a way of really thinking about what's wrong with our current society. And that framework is to say, where is there power in this economy? And where is there power that is unaccountable? In other words, where are people being significantly affected by decisions without any say over decisions? And I think when you start asking those kind of questions, you quickly come to see that there are two or three main areas, particularly workplaces, financial institutions, and investment. And so my prescriptions are for things that would improve that. And what would do so? Well, over the short term, things like increased unionization, of course, would give workers increased say over their workplace. Things like bank regulation would give the community and the nation more say over the way banks operate. Those are good things. Over the long term, I think real democracy, real genuine economic democracy, requires more profound changes. It requires things like worker cooperatives, public banking system, participatory budgeting. Those are much more ambitious changes, but I think those are the things that really do provide the kind of full accountability that I've been talking about. So at the end of the book, so most of the book explores these individual counterexamples, and at the end I try to tie these all together to illustrate how these things would work in a market economy, but a market economy that is deeply democratized and therefore look quite different to the one that we're familiar with today.
Interesting stuff. I mean, it really is. Go ahead. I cut you off there.
I think just the last thing I would point out is that when I talk to people about this, before I've talked about any of the details, there's a kind of worry that these ideas are utopian. And so I think it's important to point out that none of the ideas that I talk about here are utopian in the sense that they've never existed, right? Worker cooperatives, credit unions, capital controls, participatory budgeting. We have concrete examples of these. You can go and look at them and study them. And that's not to say they work flawlessly everywhere, but there are real examples. So there's nothing impossible about these institutions. The trick, of course, is taking the examples that do exist and expanding and growing them. And that's not necessarily easy, but it is, I think, possible. And that the fact that these organizations exist does, I think, show that they are that they are viable. And that to me is just really important, because so often our kind of initial knee-jerk reaction is to say any kind of broad systemic change is just completely impossible or utopian. And that really hamstrings our ability to think clearly about alternatives, which is damaging, particularly at a time like this with inequality is so damaging, and really deep systemic thinking is increasingly important.
And never a better time than right now, with where we are in this world, than to perhaps look at some significant change, right?
Exactly, that's right.
All right, Tom Malleson, assistant professor at King's University College at Western University, the author of the book After Occupy: Economic Democracy for the 21st Century. Tom, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut.
We say we love being on Capitol Hill for many reasons, but one reason is because they have to walk by our studio to get to work. Members of Congress, right? That's right. So we just have somebody down at the front door. Alicia's down at the front door. We just snare them,
flagging people down
as they're walking by, or they may stop for a cup of coffee. They think they're going we grab them right away, like the Honorable Rosa DeLauro, Congresswoman from Connecticut's 3rd District, in studio with us this morning again.
Well, so glad to be with you, and I'm glad to be snared in.
We snagged you.
Good. There you go.
Thanks for coming in.
It's great.
That's what you get for living on the Hill.
Right.
But neighbor, we run into the Congresswoman at the Eastern Market often, and other local restaurants and places.
Right.
So, well, Congresswoman, the President is meeting today with, it's an unusual group of invitees at the White House, the presidents of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, meeting with our president and vice president to talk about what can be done about this humanitarian crisis at the border, where the Republicans seem to think do nothing again. Right? What is your take on what's going on and what we can do about it?
Of what we let me just say, first and foremost, that there are two or three things. If the House of Representatives, with this Republican majority, had responded to what the United States Senate did in a bipartisan way in passing comprehensive immigration reform, we would be not where we are today. Serious enforcement, serious border security, serious looking at a path to citizenship. All of the efforts that need to get done in order to do something about immigration reform. It is all there in that piece of legislation. They refuse, they continue to refuse, and Speaker Boehner says that it is dead. That being said, I had the opportunity yesterday. Our leader, invited me to a meeting with the president of Honduras and Guatemala. The foreign minister from El Salvador was there. The president was flying in. So we had the opportunity to listen to them, but also to speak out. The issue on the border. Let me say two things about this because it's a complicated issue. I'm not sure that most people know, that most Americans know, that by law, a law passed in 2008 to deal with a sex trafficking issue, that a bipartisan Congress passed and George Bush signed into law in 2008, the Trafficking Protection Act, which in essence said that the Department of Health and Human Services, by law, had to take unaccompanied children and process them, feed them, and deal with health issues. And by the way, HHS immunizes every child that's coming in.
Really? Yeah.
Yes, they immunize them and then place them somewhere while they await a deportation hearing. That is the law of the land.
Required by law.
It's required by law, which is to be known. We have situations in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, in terms of their violence, corruption, etc., which has moved children more quickly across unaccompanied children.
Mm-hmm.
Adults who come are deported summarily, in essence. So are families who come with children. They go back and are deported. It's the unaccompanied children that we are looking at. They've been coming in at small rates over the last 2 or 3 years, but because of the instability in their own countries are moving more rapidly. To that issue, and I have a very personal stake in this, and I said this to the president of Guatemala yesterday. 7 years ago, in some months, my daughter and son-in-law asked Stan and I to accompany them to Guatemala to pick up their adopted baby boy, Teo. And we went. And he is now 7 years old. He is one of the lights of our lives. He knows where he's from Guatemala, and he wants to go back. He wants to see that. But my advice, and it would be only advice to my daughter and son-in-law, is not to go. And I said this to the president because of the violence. And one can talk about what the United States can do with regard to refugees and humanitarian issues. On the other hand, and this is what I said to the presidents yesterday, I said, what are you doing? What is going on with the corruption? What is going on with the police? What's going on with violence and gangs, etc., that are beating up these children, young women, girls, not young women, girls being raped because they've seen a greater influx of girls coming across the border. You must take control of your country. And yes, we want to help to deal with the humanitarian crisis, but one of the prime responsibilities that governments have is to make sure that their citizens are safe.
Sure.
And that's what they have to take on. In the meantime, we do have to take a look at this as a humanitarian crisis. It's not opening the door to accept everyone, but we do have a process in place, and we need the supplemental dollars that the president is talking about in order to speed up the process of making the determination of eligibility and of increasing the opportunity for the Department of Health and Human Services to carry out what they need to carry out by law.
By law, right. Now, I'm glad you mentioned about what the president's saying, because the responsibilities of other countries. Because some people are saying, no, we just, like John McCain and I think Lindsey Graham both said, no, we just send them back. Just send them back. I mean, send them back to what? To certain death for many of them.
No, it really is. It's gang violence. They're being beat up. As I said, young girls being raped. And imagine the desperation of a family that says, and these children are coming in from toddlers to those, and the law goes from, under 18. So you're getting very young kids, yes, and 18-year-olds. But we have a system in place. We ought to acknowledge that, but we also need to deal with enforcement. We need to deal with border security. I come right back around to comprehensive immigration reform. We have the opportunity to do it. They will not allow this legislation to come up where we could address all of these issues.
Everything they talk about, everything they say they want was in that.
It's in the bill.
In that bill, and
it's not everything that everyone wants. But imagine I'm assuming, because I don't have the vote tally in my head, but John McCain, Lindsey Graham, all these other, they voted for it.
14 Republicans voted for it.
14 Republicans voted for it. Yeah. They came together. They said, it's not everything we want, but this is a way to deal with a very serious issue that we have in the United States. And this is not about politics. It's not about gotcha. This is about dealing with the serious issue of immigration reform, and in this instance, a humanitarian issue which we have to deal with, and we want to ensure the safety of these youngsters, keep what we, uphold our obligations to the law. I just want to say one more thing with regard to this, and that is all these folks are talking about these children who are coming in diseased.
Oh.
That is It's so irresponsible.
Disgusting.
Because as I said, and I know, because this issue comes before the Labor, Health, and Education Human Services Subcommittee of Appropriations, in which I am the senior Democrat. These children are immunized when they come here. Whether or not they have been immunized in their own country, and some of these countries, I don't know what the percentages are, but they have a higher rate of immunization in some instances than the United States does. So if kids are getting colds and who throw up, my grandkids get cold and get sick, and that's it. But they're not coming in diseased, and that is irresponsible.
No, it was some of the attacks on some of the Tea Party members of the House. I mean, calling them gang members and thugs and
they're victims of gang members, and that's why their countries have to do that. We have to crack down on those smugglers. That's serious enforcement, which we said yesterday in that meeting, that in order for the United States to act, we have to understand that these countries are doing something about those coyotes, the smugglers who are taking these children for a price. These kids not only experience unbelievable brutality in their own countries, but on that road across the desert, these girls are being raped, these kids are being beat up as they come. And those are not the values of the United States of America. We ought to look at this carefully. This is not a simple matter.
And if there's any issue demanding action on the part of the Congress before they take this long break, this is the one. Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro fighting the good fight here on behalf of all of us in the United States Congress. Before we get into e-cigarettes, Congresswoman, the Rules Committee of the House voted yesterday by 7-4 vote. They're going to go ahead with this lawsuit against President Obama over Obamacare.
Right. Well, I think what a sad commentary, Bill. And I say that for this reason. Think about what is happening in the United States. We just came from talking about a very serious immigration problem, that we have the opportunity to pass comprehensive immigration reform. We have serious economic problems. We have to look at how we deal with the single biggest economic problem we have today, and that is that people do not have enough to live on. Their wages today, if they've lost their job and gone back to work, it is a lower wage. So we're looking at ways in which, by increasing the minimum wage, educational opportunity, creating jobs through infrastructure and other areas, looking at ways to be able to give people a better way of life, serious issue today. And what are the Republicans doing? They are suing the President of the United States to know, and there is no outcome. They will spend money. They will take time instead of deliberating in a responsible way the very serious issues that the American people are facing. It's not members of Congress.
Right.
It's about the people of this country. No wonder they say Washington doesn't understand what our lives are about today. We're struggling. Help us.
Yeah. No, and this is the only thing that they can come together on. The Republicans come together on. Now let's go to e-cigarettes because this is a big issue, and they're growing. Their use is growing. There's so many flavors out there. What should be done about e-cigarettes?
Well, first of all, I wrote to Commissioner Hamburg at the FDA a while ago and asked that that we have a ban on e-cigarettes for minors, for children 18 and under. And in April, I was very pleased to see what I believe is a good first step, and that is a rule calling for the banning of e-cigarettes to minors.
Yes.
What I now have done in the last several days, and really in a bipartisan way, written to the commissioner and asked that what they do is to speed up that rule-making process, that deal within it with a year. So from April 25th to next April, that we can issue the final rule, and that would go into practice, and that we ought to ban as well these flavorings, very, very appealing to children.
Oh, yeah. There are, what do we see, 7,500 or so, Peter, we saw in that article last week in the New York Times.
Yeah,
right?
and everybody gets mad when we talk about this because I say, blueberry, and they get like a chocolate milk flavored.
Bubble gum?
It's like, come on.
Really? Bubble gum?
So I said, if you're a grown-up, or I said no grown-ups are smoking that, right? And so everybody got mad and said, well, they're grown-ups. Well, if you're a grown-up, you shouldn't be doing bubble gum flavored.
But the issue is as well, look, let's take a look. I have a problem with e-cigarettes, but let's talk about kids.
Yeah.
Why are we... That's the market. One of the things we discovered in the tobacco fight years ago and smoking, and we had the documentation, which showed with the tobacco companies that they continue to looking for new markets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And where were their new markets? It was 12 and under. We found the documentation.
Whoa.
So, and this is advertising. Have you seen the packaging of these e-cigarettes? How colorful it is. Now, I know from experience in my own household that about focus groups.
Mm-hmm.
I was at a press conference.
Right.
I was at a press conference, and if you see the NBC, the colors, the red, the blue, the green,
rainbow.
the yellow, which they did off the Peacock years ago, but they did that. It's beautiful. Now they tested that, but when I saw the packaging on the e-cigarettes, it's all those colors. So I know that these companies are doing focus groups to see what is going to appeal to youngsters particularly. And, that's their market, and we should stop that now. We also should make the packaging child-proof, so that,
seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah. There are issues here, which I think we can look at in terms of kids and safeguarding children. And then we can deal with adults and then when you test or do what you're going to do. But my view, and that's why I, talked about this earlier, wrote to the commissioner and did that again this time, is to say, let's ban this for minors. Let's move quickly on doing it. And they've taken a good first step, which I applaud them for.
Yeah, good for you and good for being out in front on this issue and for so many issues. You got so much on your plate, we're going to let you get back to work.
Okay, all right.
And thank you so much.
It's a joy. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for spending some time with us this morning.
Appreciate it.
Have a great
Thank
weekend.
you very much.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Mike Barnes, Tom Malleson, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.